what I remember about my grandfather, one thing that I really remember about him, he used to say, if you're hiring young fellows, young boys, one boy was fine, 2 boys were half a boy, and 3 boys were no boys at all. And another thing I remember about my grandfather, George, is him standing in the barnyard, and he always had a tie on. Doesn't matter what he was doing, he always wore a shirt and a tie. And I was going to school, so I was going through the barnyard, up through the woods to go to school with my brother. And I came across a tree, and it had this thing up in the tree, and it had big black eyes and rings on its tail, and I was scared stiff, so I ran back to the house, and my grandfather stopped me and said, "Where are you going?" And I said, "Well, there's such a thing up in the bush." And he says, "It's just a raccoon." And he says, "Go back to school." So my name was Rogers, and I'm going to talk about the Rogers families. And the family originated in England, and I do have pictures here which you could look at afterwards. And my grandfather, George, came to Canada in 1885. In 1886, he came to Victoria. He worked on the Madrona farm in James Bay, and apparently he operated another farm on Toronto Street. And James Bay at that time was growing, so he decided that he would lease property on the Gorge Road, and he leased the Craigielee farm. And there's pictures here of the Craigielee farm. His dairy business kept growing, so he eventually ended up purchasing land to the west of Lake Hill. And the Lake Hill is now known as Christmas Hill. And at the same time, about that time, he married Lily Stevens. She had come out from England too, and they were married on January the 16th, 1897 in the Christchurch Cathedral. Their first child, Rosa, was born, Rosa Ethel, and she was born when they were at the Craigielee farm. Then they moved to the Lake Hill farm, and I just have to show you sort of where it is. Went through, and today, if you were trying to visualize where the farm was, it's right where the Pacific Christian School is on the Pat Bay Highway, and that is roughly where all the barns were. My grandfather first bought on the west side of where the highway is now, and then he gradually expanded over to the left hand, or to the east of the highway now, and that was what we know was known as the Chesterlee Farm. I am going to try and read a little bit about the Chesterlee Farm, because it is interesting when you go back into the history of who owned the land there. This is an excerpt that my dad's cousin wrote. And it says, early in 1903, a large tract of land bordering the east side of what we have called Agnes Street property, which would run into the Pat Bay Highway, became available, and George quickly took steps to acquire it. This new property was part of an original grant of land from the A Company of Gentlemen Adventurers trading into Hudson's Bay to John Casper von Allman. And this original indenture, dated September the 10th, 1858, identifies the grant to the Victoria District Section 65, covering 312 acres, including the north half of Lake Hill, which is Christmas Hill. And I can't help but wonder whether Van Almen Avenue hasn't been misnamed. It should be Von Almen Avenue. In 1904, my dad, George Wright Rogers, was born, and George, his father, terminated the Craigie Lee lease on the Gorge Road in 1907. A third child, Beatrice Mary, was born in 1908, and in 1910, polio struck Rosa Ethel at 11 years of age. And here's, this is a family photo of the Rogers family. And about the time of the First World War, my grandmother, Lily, was very involved in doing good works for the Red Cross Society. And she did a lot of knitting and a lot of sewing and organized a group of ladies to make garments for the men overseas. And she did such a good job that she won a contest of knitting socks. And I brought the cut glass vase to show you what she had won there. They also had garden parties at their home on Agnes Street, where their original family was. And they had Red Cross parties to raise funds. About the time my grandmother had a heart attack at age 49, so she died. And after she died, my grandfather George built another home on the east side of what is now the Pat Bay Highway. And go back to my aunt, Rosa Ethel. When she was struck with polio, that was very traumatic for the family. And as a result of her polio, she lost the use of her legs and one arm. It did eventually come back somewhat, but she always walked with a brace, and she used to paint pictures, and I brought some of her pictures that she painted. She used to lie on her stomach and paint, and she did some very lovely watercolors. One anecdote that my father used to tell me about the railroad that went through their property, which was the V&S Railroad, that when it was in the summertime, the fields would catch on fire and they would have to go out and knock down the flames from the train. And my aunt, Rosa, she wrote some anecdotes of what she remembered. And she said the V&S Railroad passed through our farm and was convenient transportation to the city. The stopping place, if it was flagged, was about 100 yards from our house and was known as the Red Barn Crossing after a barn on the property on the opposite side of the track. It was also known as the Rogers Crossing. The small platform made of logs seemed very inadequate when the train rumbled by and far too close to the track for safety. So we all stood on the road and well back until the train, hissing steam, came to a halt. It was known as the Cordwood Express. The train was seldom on time, and we could watch for it from our dining room window and detect the trail of smoke, or after dark its lights after it left the Royal Oak station. And she had written a few other comments too about my grandmother Lily, who was aged 21 when she left England, was inspired with a spirit of adventure and a desire to visit faraway places, quickly became eager to leave England when the opportunity arose. Friends were going to Canada, to the far west of the great continent. Victoria was a long way from home, family and friends, but here was a chance to see at last part of the world. Lily made her preparations. Her father, when told of her plans, passed it off as just another youthful fantasy. With so large a family, he could not give credence to every rumor that came to his ears, as no daughter of his would leave the beloved homeland to go wandering about a wild and dangerous country, rumored to be inhabited by barbarous Indians and vicious wild animals. His incredibility turned to consternation when he discovered she was actually making preparations for her departure. Lily did her best to assuage his fears for her safety and assured him Canada was not nearly as uncivilized as he imagined, that she was going to a town of considerable size with churches, stores, hotels, and daily newspaper and streetcars. After all, this was 1893. After she left, he declared he'd have tied her down if he'd had time to fully realize the enormity of her act. He knew that this precipitate step could influence her entire future existence. Lily had no crystal ball to indicate her way into the unknown. No friend or relative would greet her at the journey's end. She had determination to make a new life in a new country and faith to take that step. She was a vivacious, attractive girl living at home with her parents and brothers and sisters near Wiltshire. And as the eldest, she had served her apprenticeship as a tailoress. She also describes Christmas in their house on Agnes Street. Says, Christmas was the highlight of the year to us children. We counted the weeks and the days until it was time for us to hang our stockings by the big red fireplace in the dining room in readiness for the visit of that jolly old gentleman, Santa Claus. That, however, saw much activity in the kitchen. It was time to make mincemeat and plum puddings. Currants and raisins were washed and dried. Suet, which came in large chunks, was dissected and chopped. Peel, which also came in large pieces, was finely cut. Everyone helped stir the puddings for luck. Then the lucky tokens were added: silver coins, 5 cents and 10 cents, pieces for wealth, a ring to indicate the recipient could expect an early marriage, a button for the confirmed bachelor, and a thimble for the one doomed to be an old maid. When the puddings were steaming merrily on the big wood-burning range, someone had to keep an alert ear for the whistle that would indicate the steamer, a 3-tiered affair which could process at least 3 large puddings. One above the other was in need of more water. Mother always insisted on at least 3 puddings, one for Christmas, one for New Year's Day, and another for father's birthday. The weeks just preceding Christmas always seemed interminable length to me when I was old enough to know what it was all about. A few days before Christmas, a large quantity of Oregon grape leaves were gathered from nearby woods. Festoons of these were hung across the living room and dining room with red paper bells at the most effective places. Mother had a natural sense of artistry that was reflected in all she did, so the house was soon transformed for the Christmas festival. Joyful expectation was in the air when Mother announced, "Daddy is going for the tree now," and he started out with the axe to select a suitable specimen to meet her rigid specifications. Not too short, not too tall, a well-formed tree, sturdy enough to carry the myriad of glittering ornaments and the dozens of candles, as well as gifts for the family, employees, and friends fortunate enough to be visiting at Christmas time. After what seemed a long time, Father would stagger in with the big tree. It was quite a feat to bring a tree of such proportions into the living room and set it up in the bay windows, its trunk firmly placed in a large tub of stones. A tree out of doors seems smaller than it really is, so on occasion it was found to be impossible to raise the tree upright. Yi Hao, the Chinese cook, would say, "Too big, I catch him a saw," and he was soon reduced to the right height. Then began the task of decorating the tree. First, of all, each orange and apple had a string threaded through it. A large quantity were used, tied to the branches to weigh them down. Then the lovely ornaments were added, the pink ship with the white sails and tinsel trimmings, little birds on tinsel nests, many varied colored balls, icicles, and last of all, yards and yards of tinsel and dozens of various colors of wax candles about 4 inches long, and little holders were snapped onto the branches. Some of the candles had globe shaped like roses, very fragile things. We always had guests for sit-down supper on Christmas Day, and in the evening the tree was illuminated with the light from the little wax candles when the gifts were distributed, and also a Christmas cracker given to each person. Then she talks about the big snow of 1916, and I do have pictures here that were taken on the farm there. Those who lived in Victoria in 1916 and old enough to remember think of February of that year as the time of the big snow. Nothing like it had occurred to disrupt traffic and industry since the city was incorporated, although some of the early settlers had experienced some bitter winter weather. January had been a month of low temperatures with a few light falls of snow, enough to give George a chance to use the sled Mother had brought home from Winnipeg 3 years before. February was only a few days old when the storm began. All day the snow fell thick and fast, driven by a northeast wind. There were no radios to give storm warnings in those days. By supper time, a huge drift had made a barricade between our house to one side and the men's sleeping quarters and the barns on the other. The men had to cut a way through to come to their evening meal. All that night the storm continued. By morning the drifts were much higher, with the earth exposed where the wind had swept it away. In many places the route taken by the milk carts was blocked by 4 feet or 5 feet of snow. My father and several men with shovels attacked one such drift at the gateway leading to the lane. Against the velocity of the wind it was a losing battle, and it was useless to struggle against the elements so milk could be delivered out that day. Father entered the house half frozen, dejected, cap pulled down over his ears, was frozen to his hair, and his breath had formed ice. It was the first time in 29 years that he'd failed his customers. The babies needed the milk, and they would have got it if it was humanly possible, but it wasn't. Conditions in the city were just as bad. Everything had stopped. The streets were clogged with snow. Streetcars were stalled in their tracks. No one could get to work. There was no snow clearing equipment in the city or nearby municipalities. As soon as the snow stopped, the army from the Workpoint barracks was shoveling in the city streets, making a network of narrow tunnels for horse-drawn sleighs and pedestrians. By the next day, the snow had eased. On the level, it measured over 2 feet in depth, but it wasn't level. Everywhere the drifts impeded progress. They rose 5, 10, or 20 feet high in some places. Once more, an attempt was made to get the milk into the city, but part of Agnes Street from the railway to Glanford Avenue was blocked to the top of the fence post. No horse could get through, and digging a way through was out of the question. Permission was given by a neighbor to take down a section of a fence so that they could get through. Milk was loaded into the box wagon and drawn by a team of heavy work horses. I'll talk a little bit more about the war effort. The war continued with increasing fury. This is my aunt, Rosa Ethel, writing. Casualties in the front lines were appalling. The need for bandages and hospital garments were urgent. The Red Cross issued appeals for workers. At first, a group of women met at our house to make shirts, pajamas, and bandages from materials supplied and ready cut by the Red Cross. This arrangement proved inadequate, and a vacant house was rented and sewing machines installed. Mother was appointed supervisor for the branch workrooms. Many women were anxious to do their bit for the war effort, willingly volunteering their services. These inexperienced in sewing and knitting were anxious to learn, but their lack of training resulted in many poorly made garments, some wrongly assembled, such as sleeves in the wrong hole, and all these errors had to be remedied before the finished articles were returned to the main supply center. Mother often brought the discarded garments home, and she and another lady corrected the mistakes. Both were knitting and sewing whenever they could make time between the necessary activities of a farm home. Yards of bandages and bindings were hemmed on the treadle sewing machine. Mother won first prize for the best pair of knitted socks, with 80 pairs submitted, and that's the vase, and the award was a beautiful cut glass vase. Money for the Red Cross was needed too, so Mother suggested a garden party to be held in our garden. Father approved of the idea and supplied men and materials to make the booth. It was an afternoon and evening affair. Electric lights were strung across the lawn and with Japanese lanterns in gay colors. The weather was right, sunny, and very warm. Young girls in fancy costumes moved among the guests with trays bearing ice cream, candy, and found many ready customers. In 1917, 3 years after the war began, Mother's health began to decline, and then she had the heart attack. Then she writes about when she was stricken with polio. In September 1912, when I was 11 years old, I was stricken with polio with legs and left arm paralyzed. I was a very active child, fond of sports and playing the piano. When the doctor was leaving, he diagnosed the case. It may be weeks or months or even years before she walks again. My mother had never heard of polio, and these words must have been a great shock to her. I don't suppose I was meant to hear the doctor's verdict, but his unqualified statement brought only disbelief to my young mind. It was unthinkable that I wouldn't be able to walk and run and jump and dance as I'd always done. My father was stricken with grief. After 7 weeks in St. Joseph's Hospital, I came home, useless except for the right arm. The rehabilitation treatment was begun in the hospital and was to continue for a long period. And she had Emily Carr's sister come out. Emily Carr's sister was a masseur, so she came out and attended to my aunt, and she came out on the train. And these are pictures of the Craigley farm, which is on the Gorge Road. And that's the Craigley farm.
These pictures aren't at the mountain, and I'll take them away.
These are pictures of where the farm was on Agnes Street and what it looked like. And in some of them you can see Christmas Hill or Lake Hill in the background. And another piece of property that my grandfather used to use, which is what we call the swamp. And they used to skate on that in the wintertime. People used to come out on the train, and they would skate on the pond, which was right by where the Pat Bay Highway is now. And my grandfather also suggested to the Saanich municipality that they acquire the land through the valley, which is actually now the Pat Bay Highway. And he furnished the some of the equipment, which is the horses and so on, to do the road. And here's pictures of my grandfather harvesting grain, and also my dad harvesting grain. This is what I was brought up with on Rogers Avenue, what it looked like then from an aerial photo. This is what Rogers Avenue used to look like when I used to ride my bike to school. And this is another picture of the old house on Agnes Street, which is their family home, and looking towards Christmas Hill. Do you want to get the paintings? This is one of our milk bottles that was, we used to deliver milk to the houses. And when you look at the pictures of the Craigie farm, there is a picture of a horse and a cart, and it had great big milk cans on the back, and they used to take those to the houses, and then they would dip into the big cans with the milk jug, and they would pour the milk into the jug that the customers put out. And there is a milk ticket in there that we used to have. And this is the vase my grandmother won. These are pictures that my Aunt Rosa Ethel painted lying on her stomach when she was an adult. This is a picture of my mom and dad when they were married, and some of you might remember Bray's transfer, and the gentleman on the right was a friend of my dad. Thank you. And here's Bill from the Craigie farm, and this is the later one, which we call the Chesterley farm. And this is a route book that my dad had that he marked off when he went to customers. And here's a picture of silo filling on the Rogers farm in the early days. And this is what our milk bottle caps used to come in. And I guess that's, unless you want to ask me some questions, I don't know what else to say. Oh, I guess I should tell you about our opium.
These were the last.
Oh, these are a couple of opium bottles that we found on our farms because the Chinese workers lived there, and they, I guess they used opium and then just got thrown out in the garbage. So anyway, I did go through some garbage dumps in my younger days and found them. That's all I have to say, I think.